So he says that the police says that he's seen all that. He's seen the car come out the parking lot, and the car was driving normally, I guess. And then when it ran that stop sign, that's when the cop got behind them and proceeded to pull it over. But remember, the cop is saying that the car is coming from north and south, but the stop sign that was actually ran was coming east and west. But they have to discredit Marchello by taking that 7-Eleven off the route. They don't want nobody to know he was at 7-Eleven. Okay, so from that point, that's where it picks up. The stories collide to where the car was speeding off and the cops chased them, and it ends into a dead end cul-de-sac. And the driver jumps out, runs, never caught, and Marcello is taken to jail, and that is it. The guys were then given the $60 that were in Marcello's possession. They took that $60 from Marcello. They entered it into state's evidence, and then they gave it back to the victims. Well, not back to the victims. That was basically Marcello's money. They took Marcello's money and gave it to the victims. Now, the situation about the money, because that is what this whole case lies on, the robbery. And the robbery is of the money. The 80, $60. Because remember, they wrote 80. Once they found out Marcello had 60 on him, they crossed it out and said 60. So that's the robbery. This is why Marcello's in prison. Okay, so they took that, put it into evidence, and gave that $60 of Marcello's to them, and then the guys returned back to the club that they had left, right? Okay, so after the guys, I'm trying to figure out what part I gotta tell next. I'm so sorry. Bear with me. Bear with me. I told Marcello's story, the police's story. Oh, that's where I was. The 80, $60. So the guy said that while the car was, and this still would have had to been a very short amount of time because it's all in the same block. So when the car was pulling out of the driveway of the club, the Marcello was holding a gun on them. As the cousin was driving, Marcello was holding a gun, turning around, telling them, "Hey, you ain't got no money. Give me your wallets. Give me your wallets." So they give Marcello their wallets. They said they give them the wallets as Marcello is holding the gun. He looks into the wallet and he's like, "There's no money in this wallet." He looks into the other person's wallet, and there's no money in this wallet. "I know you got something. I know you got something." So one guy says that he remembers that he borrowed $80, $60 from his friend at the bartender at that club. He borrowed the money from the bartender. He forgot about that money he had in his pocket. So he said, "Oh, I remember I got $80 in my pocket from the bartender. Is this enough? Just let us go. Just let us go." All right. So that's how they said that the money was taken. Marcello looked at both wallets and threw them down because hey, they didn't have no money in there, and he forced them to produce some money, which the guy remembered. Hey, I borrowed $60 from the bartender, and that's the money that Marcello ended up with in his pocket that was taken from Marcello and given to them. Okay, so Marcello said he asked could they pull surveillance. He was adamant. I was not at that club. I was the street over at the 7-Eleven. I wasn't at that club at all. I came from the 7-Eleven. I didn't come from there. So he was like, "Can't you just check the surveillance and see that I'm not there? Like, I'm nowhere near that club at all." And Marcello's public defender that he had that defended the case said, no, we can't check the surveillance because there's no surveillance in the parking lot. Remember, they said on the busiest club night, there was nobody else in the parking lot and nobody around, and now there's no surveillance. Okay, so Marchello was like, okay, so can you pull the surveillance from the 7-Eleven to prove that's where I was? I was picked up like right close from walking there. I literally just left the 7-Eleven. And and actually the surveillance of the 7-Eleven would have showed which direction Marcello would have left, that 7-Eleven. Because if Marcello left heading down the road, that would be consistent with leaving from the 7-Eleven to going back to his cousin's house. But if it showed him leaving the 7-Eleven heading down that main highway, that could be consistent with him going to that club. But they said, no, we cannot pull the surveillance at 7-Eleven because it costs too much money. We don't have money to do that. So Marcello was like, okay, so I can't pull surveillance to prove I wasn't there, and I can't pull surveillance to prove I was here. So they took that basically from him. So Marcello could not prove his whereabouts. Okay, so there was no proof that this robbery ever happened in that parking lot, right? Okay, so later on it goes that after all that happened, the guys returned back to the club. So what you really need to see is what this really looks like. The guys were at a club getting ready for a big club night. Across the street from the club is the hood. The hood is literally across the street. Drug infested, crime riddled neighborhood. The guys were trying to go in the hood to, if you know what I mean. I can't say that on YouTube, but you know what they were trying to go across the street for, right? To get right before this dance. That's what they were doing. And they can't just take their behinds up in the hood. You can't just go up in nobody's hood. What hood you can just willy-nilly go into? You got to be taken into the hood. On the way to being taken into the hood, Marcello gets into this car. Okay, so this whole situation is basically a drug deal that was on its way to happening but hadn't happened yet. That's the only logical explanation for what the situation was. Those guys, and that's why they returned back to that club, because they went out just to get right and come back. And that's why they were so scared, because they thought that they were going to go to jail as well. But when they realized, hey, the cops believed that we were kidnapped, robbed, and carjacked, they went with that, right? So later, Marcello, his trial came, and the whole time the public defender just kept saying, hey, you need to take these 17 years. You got to take 17 years. This is carjacking. This is robbery with a firearm. And because the guy said you had cold steel against their nose. That's how the whole gun charge is based on that. By the guy saying he had cold steel against my nose. No gun was ever recovered in this case. No physical gun that you could touch, look at, smell. They don't have a picture of it. They don't have nothing. The gun is because the guy said he had felt cold steel against his nose. That is the gun in Marcello's case. And that is all that they have. Okay. So The public defender kept saying, you need to take these 17 years. This is a gun charge. If you don't take that, they're going to basically just, you're going to be a goner. Like, you got to take these 17 years. And Marcello's like, 17 years for what? I didn't do anything. I literally jumped in the car for a second with my cousin and never, like, what the heck? And you want me to take 17 years for what? The gun that they're placing there because of the cold steel against his nose was never ever said by nobody to be fired, to be shot, and nobody hurt. The guys got in the car and got out the car the same exact way. There was no injuries to them, no bodily injuries to them. So he's like, you got to take these 17 years. And Marcello's like, 17 for what? And going through a trial where you see they're charging you with gun charges, but there's no gun. They said that they scanned that car, dusted that car for fingerprints, but there's no fingerprints on the car matching Marcello. They also asked the state attorney why, the DA, why. You could easily prove that Marcello clearly robbed them because everyone said that both of the victims said that Marcello had their wallets. Why didn't you dust the wallets for Marcello's fingerprints? And you chose not to. They say you also could have disproved that Marcello was at that 7-Eleven. You could have proved that. You also could have proved that Marcello wasn't working and he really wouldn't have had $80. I mean $60. You had all ample opportunity. Marcello is innocent until proven guilty, and it was your burden to prove him guilty. So why didn't you produce these things you could have easily produced? You could have easily dusted those those wallets for Marcello's fingerprints, and they definitely would have turned up his fingerprints because you said he definitely had that wallet. Why didn't they dust them? Well, number one, now let me tell you the situation about the wallet. There was different stories about the wallets, right? One said they said Marcello took their wallets, right, and was looking at them for money, and he was like, "Hey, y'all don't have no money. Y'all gotta have something. Y'all gotta have something. Give me some." And then they realized that they had the money from the bartender. And in which, why was the bartender not called to trial? Because I'm sure the bartender would have said, "Hey, yeah, I did lend my friend $80. Sure, I did." They didn't, the state didn't do that. Okay, so the wallets, it was a discrepancy on how the guys got their wallets back. One said that Marcello, now it was said that the one in the back seat somehow got his wallet back. Nobody knows how he got his wallet back, but he had his own wallet back in his possession. The other one said that the wallet was on the floorboard. Now, first the police in the police report said the second wallet was found on the floorboard of the car in the front passenger side, which the front passenger side is equivalent to where Marcello was riding, right? So when the car was when in the trial they were saying that the first wallet the guy had, that's the same. Somehow he got his wallet back. Never was figured out how he got it back, but he got it back in the back seat. The second one, he said his wallet was on the ground outside. And then he said, "The ground? You mean the floor?" He said, "Oh, I meant the floor ground." changing it back to what the police said, which was the floorboard. So he had already told and said that the wallet was on the ground, but now he's changing it during the trial and said the floor ground. I mean the ground, because they said, which one do you mean, the floor or the ground? Where's the wallet? So he's like, oh, I meant the floor ground. I meant the ground, the floor. This is how trial went. They weren't consistent at all. Okay, so the thing is, the wallet being on the ground could be consistent with Marchello dropping that wallet when he got out the car. Remember when he got out the car? Since he had that wallet, the wallet could have dropped on the ground. But the police report, and they initially said on the floorboard in the car, right? But that passenger, before Marchello entered that car, before they allowed the cousin to drive them in the hood to get right, that guy was sitting in that front passenger seat, and he could have dropped his own wallet. His own wallet in that front passenger seat before Marchello even entered the vehicle minutes later. And if you want to say Marchello was guilty, that's fine. You could have 100% proved that by dusting the fingerprints. Because if Marchello had that wallet, his fingerprints would have been on that wallet. But you chose not to. Okay. So also they returned back to the club, and that was because they had gotten back to the club just in time for that tea dance to start at midnight, because the scene was released a little before midnight. Marchello was off the jail and they were back to the club. Now they didn't get the chance to get right because the police had stopped them. So they returned back to the club. They asked them in the trial, why would you go return back to a club where you were just taken from your destination, robbed, and carjacked? Why would you return right back there moments later? And one replied, because we were so shaken up about what happened that we had to get a drink because we were so shaken up. Okay, so now so that's all the sides of what was said. Okay. Now, in the initial report, they already allowed them to change the monies to reflect one another. They took that picture of Marchello, right? That night after he got out the car. Okay. So during trial, the only state evidence that they had was a picture of that car and a picture of Marchello that they took that night. And they presented that picture that they took of Marchello to each person, to each of the victims that were the quote unquote victims that were put on the witness stand. They presented it to them. They allowed, I believe, the jury to see it as well. And they were saying, questioning and saying, do you recognize this picture? This is a prior booking photo of Marchello. Okay. At that point, the judge calls the state attorney up to his bench and says, you better tread lightly because you're trying to insinuate that Marchello, that's a prior booking picture of Marchello. When you know in all actuality, that is a photo y'all took of him that night. Marchello has no priors. So she was trying to make it look like he had already, done things in the past, presenting that picture as though it was a prior booking photo, when in all actuality, it was a picture that they had took the same night. Okay, so now here it goes. They also allowed during trial, they allowed the two guys to add in that as we were driving, we were so scared for our lives because Marchello said that he was going to drown us. So now they added in being drowned. And I'm like, none of that was ever mentioned, no time before, ever. All those times going to court, I mean, not court, going to, the lawyer with him to talk and brief stuff and all that stuff. Nobody ever mentioned that. When they come to trial, that's when they mention that Marchello said that they were going to drown them in the lake. Well, guess what's right behind the club? A lake. And it was like, if Marchello was going to drown you in the lake, why did he go the opposite way? The lake is behind the club. And they said, oh, no, no, because he was going to take us to a more secluded lake. And we were like, how can you add that? Nothing had nothing to do with a lake. But by the time trial came, they added in a lake situation. But when the public defender tried to say, hey, this is not actually a carjacking and robbery, this is going to go in the hood to buy drugs. The judge did not allow. They said there was no drugs found, so we are not going to allow that situation of drugs to be placed into this scenario. But they allowed being drowned in a lake to be placed into the scenario. So that also made no sense. All right, so I'm trying to think on the fly of all the discrepancies. Okay, so later, that same club had a robbery in the parking lot. It was years later, yes, but it was later. The same club, had a robbery in the parking lot. And they said the way that they found the suspect in that robbery was they checked the surveillance cameras in the parking lot. Remember, they told Marchello there was no surveillance cameras in the parking lot. So either in between the time that this happened with Marchello to that time, sometime in between they put up surveillance cameras, or that club/hotel always had surveillance cameras. Why would you not have surveillance cameras in a club, in a sketchy neighborhood? That makes no sense. So that was proven to be a lie. There's another lie that the scene of the crime. Remember how I told you that they changed the road because they wanted to tie that club in. That's why they had to change the road, because they had to prove that Marchello was at that club and it, in fact, kidnapped them and took them from their destination, robbed them, carjacked them, and all of that. They had to prove that. So they, on the report, said that they were coming down that road. Okay, in all actuality, it makes no sense because the road is so short. From the destination that the car stopped, from the parking lot, number one, you couldn't have seen them come out the parking lot. That's your first lie. You couldn't see that. Nobody can see that unless you're Superman and you got X-ray vision. You can see that. Okay, but they couldn't have seen that, so that's the number one lie that the police officer that wrote the report put in there. Then they said that they got behind them. They did a high-speed chase. It's not enough room to do a high-speed chase to turn around and get behind them. None of that. None of that. There's no room for that. But on the street that Marchello said he was walking down, there actually is room for that, because the chase actually came down the street and went around the block. It ended in a dead end. If it was the street that the police said, they literally would have had a short stretch of area and the dead end was right there. There was no way for all that high-speed chase and this and that. None of it coincided. Okay, but later we find out this same arresting officer in Marcello's case, there's another case where they said that it was a guy, and I'm going to find that article and read it to you. that he had carjacked and robbed somebody. They used the same charges for everybody. It's like, how do you can't come up with the same goddamn sets of charges? But they say he carjacked and robbed somebody, and the guy was running. He was using people as a shield and all types of stuff. And they shot him and shot him down. But once they shot him down, he raised his arm up and was able to somehow keep shooting at them. And they just shot 50 times. And it was said that they had excessive force. Like, it was overkill because they had already shot him down. Okay, so they said when they questioned the officers on the reason behind this overkill, all the officers had all these different accounts. They had completely different stories. One said this, one said that. They said it was disharmonious, is how they referred to it. And none of it made sense. It was him and 5 other officers. Well, the same situation with Marchello. There was him, the officer that had that discrepancy in another case, disharmonious after overkill. They It was the guy that was riding with him, and it was the female officer. Okay, so the officers were all questioned, and they all had different accounts. One officer tried to say Marchello ran them football fields away, right? But when they, through cross-examination and plus the spot that he was picked up was right there with the car, it was proven that if Marchello didn't cross the railroad track, there is no way that he ran because the railroad track is literally right at the car. So it was proven that Marchello did not try to run. Now, so one said he ran, one said he didn't run. Then another said, I believe the lady tried to say that he ran, but after being cross-examined, it was like, so in all actuality, Marchello couldn't have run. And it ended up, yes, he didn't run. Okay. So everybody was like, so nobody and everybody, the 2 quote unquote victims and all the police, all say that they didn't get a good look at the driver. They all got a good look at Marchello, but nobody got a look at the driver as he ran off. Now, the lady officer said that she chased them. She chased both of them, and both of them looked back. Marchello and his cousin looked back at her, right? But they say, hold on, wait, he looked back at you, so you kind of seen the cousin. And then she says, oh, no, 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 I didn't get a good look at him. The victims, they said they couldn't see the cousin. They didn't see him. But how could you not see him when you're sitting, like you're literally, like one is sitting adjacent to him in the back, and one is, and plus he looked in your window, right? Remember, they said that he came up on one side and he came up on the other. But in all accounts, nobody can give any account of what this driver looked like. They gave so many different descriptions. One says he's taller, he's shorter, he's smaller, he's bigger, there's no hard description in it, but everybody can clearly describe Marchello as a black guy with dreads. My question is, how did you describe him as a black guy with dreads when his hair was braided down that night by yours truly, right? How did that happen? Okay, so then also there's the situation where there's a female that says, I know Marchello didn't do this. I know he didn't do this. But if he don't be with me, I'm going to make sure he gets screwed through the system. My uncle is the chief of police. And everybody laughed her off. But we asked for her to be called to court. because at least she was saying that Marchello did not do this. And when we gave the public defender her information, he said, no, she cannot be called to court. And we were like, why can't she be called to court? And the public defender replied, because she is an uncredible witness. Okay, fine, she can't be called to court. Later, after trial, they never called her to court. But after trial, remember when I say I ran out into the street and laid in the street? And what woke me up out the street was seeing the public defender come outside. Well, the public defender served me something. And he said, here's something that also helped convict Marchello. It was never presented during trial at all. But guess what it was? It was a written statement from that female that said Marchello was with her that whole evening leading up to this crime, and that she braided his hair, and while she was braiding his hair, he was telling her how he was about to go find somebody to rob. I thought he was with me at the movies and I braided his hair. So when did she do this? When did that happen? Remember, I spent the whole evening with him. We went to the mall, to that Point Orlando. We went to the movies. I braided his hair. I didn't drop him off until evening time. So you mean to tell me I braided his hair down? He unbraided it and let her braid it back. And while she was braiding it back down in the same day, hours later, not even hours later, he was saying that, hey, I'm going to go commit a robbery. So they allowed her written statement to be placed into, and said that this was what helped, this also helped convict Marchello. So why wasn't I called to court then? Because he wasn't with her. She's lying. Like, she's completely lying. And she's not the only one lying. Like, all of this is orchestrated. Okay, so they escalated it. So it started with one thing, but by the time it went to trial, they escalated it up and then added in this drowning situation and all this other stuff to trump it up even more. Okay, so let's go back to before trial. The lawyer kept saying, just take the 17 years. He was like, look, well, the first trial, which it was the same trial. It was, trial date came around and not a soul showed up but Marchello Jackson and myself. We were the only ones sitting outside the courtroom, just sitting there, until finally the public defender comes out and says, hey, so nobody showed up? And he was like, so we're going to have to continue the case. And he was like, usually, we would have to let you go. But instead of letting you go, because nobody showed up to press charges against him. The two victims did not show up to court. Okay. He said, so if they don't show up again, then we're basically going to have to drop the charges and let you go. In his next breath, he says, but I'm going to go out of town because the two victims, right after this incident, they moved to two different states. One moved to this state and one moved to that state. Now, does that make any sense? After you was just robbed, taken from your location, carjacked, you're not going to come to court to make sure that this horrible man is put in prison? Like, they moved to two different states. I have the subpoenas. They subpoenaed both of them 3 times separately, each person. So that is a total of 6 subpoenas. They ignored, they rejected, and it was sent back. subpoenaing them to court. They didn't show up. They subpoenaed them 3 times and they never responded to it. And when trial came, they didn't show up. So what ended up happening with that was the lawyer was like, so I got to go out of town and see how I can go get them to come to court. And we're like, that don't make sense. If they don't come to court, they have to let him go. So why would you be going out of town to get them to court? So we didn't know that. I just found out that 3 subpoenas were sent out apiece and they kept ignoring them. I just found that when I just got those transcripts, ordered his transcripts this year. That's when I found that out. We always felt like the lawyer worked against us, but we did not know for sure. They kept trying to get them to come to court and they wouldn't, and they didn't show up. So instead, they continued it. So the lawyer had one more attempt to make sure they get to court, because without them coming to court, the charges had to be dropped. So this is how Marcello's own lawyer got them to come to court. He went before the judge and he asked them for money. He petitioned the court for money for travel and lodging. For state number 1, he went to the guy's house, subpoenaed him in person. Then he also came back and he petitioned the court to go to state number 2 to subpoena in person the second person. That's why they came to court. Because if he had sent those out again, it would have been rejected again and nobody would have showed up and all charges would have been dropped and Marcello would have been free. But because of Marcello's own public defender, he is not free. He made sure that they came to court. And when they did come to court, they had different accounts on every situation. Nothing lined up. One said this, one said that. One said this, one said that. Then one of them was so shaky and fidgety and jerking around. It would look consistent with him being high, which now I know by going back and researching him. He has a lot of DUIs. He has a lot of standing in traffic, just sitting in the car, standing in traffic. That's consistent with being high or being drunk or something. And he was arrested on another DUI right at that same corner, at that same 7-Eleven that Marcello was at. So that also shows that the guy was not out of his element if he clearly lives in that neighborhood. He'd be in that neighborhood. But they were saying they were so scared. They didn't know where they were. They didn't know none of this, none of that. All they knew they was going to a lake. But there's no evidence of that. All this is a story. There is zero evidence. There's not even a gun. And you mean to tell me, with all of that, you can charge Marcello with 40 years in prison? Okay, it goes further. The judge himself said, wait a minute, y'all can't charge him with robbery. The money doesn't line up. They said Marcello took 80 from them and Marcello was found with 60. He's like, so where's the rest of the money? Where's the other part of the money? That doesn't make sense. You're not going to be able to charge him with robbery. The money don't even line up. And this man was yelling. He was like, how are you going to charge him with robbery? And robbery, the money ain't consistent. It doesn't line up. And he was like, you're not going to be able to charge him with robbery. So the state went on to say, but he tried. He was trying to rob him. He tried. He said, okay, you could pick it up as attempted robbery. So on one of the charges, so he got 2 charges for each person. So on one of them, he got a robbery which is for that 80, and the other one is an attempted robbery. Okay, but when you go and you read the jury instructions, it says that you cannot charge the other charges unless the robbery is proven, not attempted robbery, unless the robbery is proven. But the robbery was never proven because the monies didn't line up. That was Marcello's money. The money was not even the same. And there was never a gun even found, confiscated, nothing. They pulled DNA on Marcello that came back for nothing, which I don't even think this is a DNA case, but none of his DNA, none of his fingerprints, not the gun. What do you have that is holding him there? You got the two guys that are saying two different stories and saying that he had cold steel, that didn't want to come to court, that were forced to come to court by Marcello's own lawyer. So I probably have to fill in a little bit more. Then you got the corruption that the officers are showing, the lying, the changing affidavits, allowing other people to change affidavits to make it fit. Like, this is why he's wrongfully convicted. What should have happened that night? And Marcello clearly still could have been wrongfully convicted, right? What should have happened that night is, if it was a substance deal, everybody in that car, all four people, should have got a substance charge, not just Marcello. Marcello didn't even get a substance charge because a substance charge would have gave Marcello far less time. Each one of them people would have received less time. They may have gotten 5 to 10 years, I don't know, a piece. We don't know. It could have been that the two in the front, they could have got less time than the two in the back or whatever. But each one of them should have taken a substance charge. Instead, it was all thrown off onto Marcello, and it was changed from being a substance charge, and it was upgraded to being a carjacking, a kidnapping, and a strong arm robbery of two people. Each person should have took a substance charge. Instead, they threw Marcello's whole life away. And once again, I am not condoning substance charges, substance abuse or taking at all or selling. I'm not condoning none of that. But if he was, see, we don't even know if Marcello is or isn't guilty of that. That wasn't introduced. That is not what he's on trial for. He's on trial for things that never happened. No kidnapping ever happened. No carjacking ever happened. And that could have been proven by those surveillance cameras. The kidnapping and carjacking could have been proved by your surveillance cameras if in fact he did it. You could have proved this beyond a shadow of a doubt. But you didn't, because it didn't happen. And this story, now I finally told every piece, which I might have left some stuff out because it's hard to remember. But I know that female officer, I cannot find her at all. Only thing I find about that is like a situation where the department was being biased against women. And I'm thinking in my heart that most likely she was trying to say the right thing. It looked like she was trying to, because Even when she said she seen their face, like it was like she wanted to tell something, but she couldn't because she was like outnumbered. Like she seen their face. They all seen their faces, but they decided we're gonna lie. She was on the line where she might been willing to tell the truth, but you can't go against your partners. You can't go against them. So in all actuality, she had to lie, which they all came up with 3 different lies, and it stuck. They sentenced Marcello. Because we heard all this back and forth, and it was, oh, this happened, that happened, the wallet situation, none of that lined up. The robbery, none of it lined up, none of it made sense. That whole trial was just hoopla. Nothing made sense. So before recess of that trial, Marcello's public defender says, hey, do you want to take some time with your girl? Maybe go outside and, chill or whatever for a minute. And we're like, for what? We about to go home. Like, I mean, okay, but we about to go home. They lying. They've been caught in several different lies. Several different lies. And he was like, no, you really need to go out there. Then he was saying, do you want to be sentenced today? Or do you want to be sentenced in the future on a sentencing date? And we was like, what's a sentencing date? So we're completely naive. Nobody knows anything. What's a sentencing day? And they're like, oh, so that's the time when you can get together character statements and you can come petition before the court and say how he was this, and that. He was a good father. And also to tell you this, I'm sorry to keep skipping around. I'm trying to piece this long story together, and I still probably miss some stuff. But the lawyer, our daughter was a little girl, not even walking yet. And I remember she would be crawling around that public defender's desk. She'll be all up under his desk. She'll be on his desk, all up his leg. And I'd be like, Money, get down. And he's like, no, she's okay. She's okay. Later, during that sentencing day, after they charged Marcello, he sent back and he was like, oh, I wasn't aware that Marcello had family. How in the freaking heck were you not aware that he had a daughter and that a fiance? How did you not be aware of that when we were there all the time? He said he wasn't aware of that. So then in the end, the judge, he goes back and they dropped one charge because they had 2 counts of carjacking, and they was like, it's only one car. So that's when I left that courtroom because the judge put me out for crying, and he said he was about to hold me in contempt of court. So I left the courtroom. So after that, that's when they took the carjacking and made it only one because there was like he can come back on double jeopardy on that. So there's only one car, there's one carjacking. So he dropped one of those charges and amended that charge. And then he amended that second robbery to being an attempted robbery. So it's a robbery, attempted robbery. Robbery was never ever proven, and the other charges cannot stand on their own. They have to be with the robbery being completely proven. So my question also, how did the jury read through 10 pages? The jury instructions were 10 pages long. How did they thoroughly read through it and analyze each thing? Because it's not just so simple. It's so many things. They're saying you can only charge this if this is present beyond a shadow of a doubt. You can only charge this if this. So it's so many variables to decide on. And also, there was like, you also could charge him without a weapon. If you believe the state did not prove there was a weapon, you can charge him without the weapon. These are the lower charges, which Marcello wouldn't have done more than 10 years without that weapon enhancement. So the weapon enhancement being added, but the jury said, no, guilty in the highest. The jury was an all-white jury. except for one black man. There was one black juror, and the alternative juror was white as well. So, had that black man not been able to show up, it would have been an all-white jury. So I don't know. It's too much. Marchello should have never gotten 40 years. How do you recoup from 40 years? And the judge says he was being lenient on him. I really want to give him life for this. Life for what? Those two guys were not hurt, harmed, robbed, weren't carjacked, weren't kidnapped, weren't none of that. What are you giving him life for? But he said, just so, because after I pleaded my heart in front of that court, in front of that judge, the judge said, I too, if Marchello was my son, would want him to have a second chance. But the fact is that if Marchello Jackson was not stopped that day, that these two would be dead. And I'm like, I'm so shocked. Dead? How they get to dead? They weren't even hurt. How do you get to dead? So he says, so Marchello needs to feel what he done every day of his life. He needs to feel this. But he said, just so Marchello has a second shot at life, I will only give him 40 years. And remember when the judge said that the state attorney was showing the picture as though it was a previous booking record, and he says, you're aware that Marchello has no previous record. The judge still in the sentencing sheet gave Marchello points for priors. So all the way around, this was botched. If you had to charge Marchello with anything, the only thing that you really could have charged him circumstantially would have been a drug charge. That's it. And a drug charge wouldn't have been 40 years. They gave Marchello 40 years because he was not willing to take their plea bargain. So a lot of people, and the reason why Marchello went through that trial was because he knew he was innocent. He didn't carjack, rob, or kidnap anybody, and he knew that. So he knew he was innocent. But then also they didn't have any evidence. They didn't have no DNA, no fingerprints, no gun, no. What are you charging him? How are you charging him? So the case was flimsy. And when that lawyer, that first lawyer that got him out, he was like, wait a minute. How did he lose this case? This case was easy. They had nothing on Marchello. How did he lose it? Well, he lost it on purpose. He purposely was making sure Marchello got convicted. Because had he took his hands off this case and not did nothing, all he had to do was wait for them to ignore that last subpoena and not show up to court. That's all he had to do, and Marchello would have been free. And not to mention the second person not arrested on this. The person that jumped out and I guess he grew wings and flew away. Anyways, guess this is going to be the rest of my life's battle. I mean, it's been my battle for 20 years, and we're no closer. So, guess this will be my full life's battle until my husband is free. All right, guys. It's your girl, Kadlac.
It's your girl, Kadlac.